Welcome to Do the Twist, our beginning video tutorials on getting started spinning yarn on a drop spindle. So this is just the introduction and a little bit of a vocabulary lesson on just the very basics of a drop spindle, as it's something that not a lot of people necessarily are super familiar with. So these are two drop spindles. These drop spindles are exactly the same as each other. This one just has a little bit of yarn spun onto it already, and you can see the fiber still attached. And this one is empty and ready to get started spinning on. You will notice a little bit of yarn is connected to this. This yarn is called the leader, and this is just a little tiny bit of commercially spun yarn. I like to use an animal fiber because generally as you're getting started spinning, if your leader has a little bit of grippiness to it, so a little bit of the little hairs, your yarn that you are spinning is going to like to stick to it a little bit better. So this is the leader, and you truly just tie the strand of already spun commercially available yarn to the shaft of your spindle. So the shaft is the stick that runs the whole way. You tie it to the shaft underneath the whorl. So the whorl of your spindle is this part. Tied to the shaft under the whorl. And some spindles will have this little notch on them. You can see it here. There's just a little divot that goes in on the whorl of the spindle, and that puts your yarn goes through that really nice and neatly. Not all drop spindles have that. If yours doesn't have that, you don't have to go through one of those. You can just go up and over the side. Your yarn just tends to slide around just a little hair more with that. So your leader goes up and over the whorl, and then so I will actually, you've tied it on at the bottom, you go up and over the whorl, and you come around the hook. And it doesn't matter right over left, left over right, it doesn't really matter. I do like to go around kind of an extra time, so I don't just go through the hook. I typically go through it a second time. I just find that makes my spindle sort of hang nicely, and I don't have issues with the spindle sort of sliding down through the yarn. So that is how this is sort of the anatomy of a drop spindle and how you get things set up to get started at the very beginning before you've introduced any of your fiber. So I do want to show you what that looks like then on a drop spindle once you have been spinning. So this is the yarn that you are actually making, and it's called the cop when you put the yarn underneath and you create this this sort of shape that's here. And you'll see my yarn doesn't always stay in that little nook. And so this is kind of what it's going to look like as you've been spinning your yarn. And again, the yarn that you've made, I like to go around the hook kind of an extra time. I just find then the spindle hangs from that and doesn't tend to slide. Otherwise, these two drop spindles are exactly the same. There are several other styles of drop spindles. So if you've either seen somebody else working on a drop spindle or have looked up pictures online, I did just want to talk about a couple of other styles. So the spindles that coming with your kit, if you're working from our Learn to Spin kit, and the most common type of spindles, at least in the US right now, are going to be what's called top whorl spindles. And so that means the whorl is close to the top, and you put that cop of spun yarn underneath that whorl so it's out of your way. Well, another style of spindle is a bottom whorl. So this one, the whorl is at the bottom, the hook that you're going through is at the top, and you are putting that cop of yarn as you spin your yarn where you twist your yarn on above the drop spindle. The bottom whorl may be just a tiny bit more challenging to get started with if you're a brand new spinner, because as we get farther into these videos, you're actually going to take your hand and the shaft that's underneath your whorl is what you're going to be using to actually rotate your spindle. It's a shorter stick on a bottom whorl, as opposed to on a top whorl, you have a lot more to hold on to. So I do think these are just a tiny bit more challenging, although if you like the way they look or that's what you happen to have or really want to get started with, this certainly would be a fine thing to learn on as well. Everything else is going to be just the same. Your yarn's going to go through that hook and you're going to be ready to go. The last style that I am going to show you today is what's called a Turkish spindle. And this is actually, it's a very cool design. I love the idea of it. So instead of a solid whirl, you've actually got these two separate pieces. What that means is as you're winding your cop on there of the yarn that you've spun, when you're finished winding that, you can actually take this all the way off, pull these arms out, and you're going to have a solid ball of yarn already ready to go for your next thing instead of having to wind it onto something else. So that can be useful. I do think these are more challenging for beginners to get started with. So they're beautiful, and I, as a more experienced drop spindler, enjoy working on a Turkish spindle, but it's not ever something that you have to try if you don't want to, and I probably would recommend getting started with your very first spindle being a top or a bottom whirl. Another thing about this particular spindle that makes it a little bit challenging is it does not have a hook. It just has the little piece here, and you catch that with a knot to hang from that instead of hanging from a hook. So you can see how it's still pretty secure on there. You're just putting that backward slip knot on there. But again, as you're just getting started, that's kind of just a little bit extra work. So I did want to just show you the different style spindles that were out there. Not that you ever need to know this, but in case you're curious, or just if you're getting started with spindle spinning and thinking, why are there so many variations? Just talk through kind of the most common ones. You will notice that these are all different length, and although it's kind of different lengths and different sizes, and although obviously you can't feel it, they also have different weights in terms of how many ounces a drop spindle weighs. Some of them will actually write it on there, as this one does. That's fairly uncommon to get it written on the actual spindle. More commonly, if you are purchasing one, that will be part of the tag, or if you're purchasing one online, that information will be listed for you. The physical weight of the spindle is going to affect two things for you as you're first getting started, or as a more experienced drop spindle spinner. The first one is how long your spindle spins. So the heavier the spindle, the longer it's going to keep rotating as you start that twist going. So on a heavier spindle, which this is a reasonably heavy spindle, as I twist that shaft, how long does the spindle twist before it comes to a stop? And now a variety of things affect that, including how long the string is above it and how fast you spin it. But the way centrifugal force works, the heavier the spindle itself, the longer that's going to keep twisting, which can be of benefit to people that are just getting started, to have that longer time that your spindle is just going to keep rotating on its own. The other thing that the weight of the spindle is going to determine is how thin you can make your yarn. So if you've got a very heavy drop spindle, you are not going to be able to spin a super thin yarn. And that's not to say, I mean, this is a fairly heavy drop spindle, and it's not like my yarn is incredibly thick. This is actually an even heavier drop spindle, and I'm still spinning a pretty thin yarn, and I could go a little bit thinner than this. But if you truly want to spin a lace weight, very thin, fine yarn, a very physically heavy spindle is going to make that a little bit harder. Now all of this is a little bit more just because I thought people might be curious, and if you're just getting started and you're reading a lot, it can be nice to understand kind of why people talk about those things. These are not things that as a beginner you need to put tons of time and energy into understanding. They are things that the longer you go with spinning may eventually be things that you want to think about and experiment with a little bit. But more than anything, just so that you're familiar with the idea and the concept that there are different kinds of spindles and they're going to let you accomplish different things. So I will link to where you can purchase the kit or get the little handout that's just going to walk you through the steps of getting started, or keep watching the other videos in this playlist to take you through the setup and all of the park and draft steps, the plying steps, and the finishing your yarn steps.